You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 17th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Israel's defence minister concedes there is no end in sight to the fight with Hezbollah. We'll examine the prospect of an expanded conflict. Also coming up, Vladimir Putin orders a third boost to troop numbers since the invasion of Russia. We'll ask where he intends to recruit them from. Plus,
I'm Sheena Rossiter, Monocle's contributing editor in Edmonton, Canada. And today in Urbanism News, we'll be looking at those 15-minute city concepts. Which cities are making the cut and which cities aren't?
More from Sheena a little later. And we'll ask what a population crisis looks like in Greece. Plus, why one of the world's rarest but noisiest penguins is an absolute winner. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. At least 17 people have now died as a result of the extreme weather in Central Europe. The aircraft manufacturer Boeing has imposed a recruitment freeze after around 30,000 workers began a strike over pay last week. And the owner of Facebook, Meta, is to ban Russian media outlets such as RT, claiming they're carrying out covert influence operations online. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Israel's defence minister has told the United States that the prospect of a pause in fighting with Hezbollah in neighbouring Lebanon is diminishing. Meanwhile, Israel seems to be turning its military focus once again to the north of the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Defence Force says they bombed a former school being used as a Hamas command centre for the second time in days. Some are suggesting that the fighters are regrouping faster than Israel can defeat them. Well, I'm joined now by Greg Karlstrom, who's Middle East correspondent and author of How Long Will Israel Survive? The Threat from Within. A very good morning to you, Greg.
Good morning.
So just would you mind bringing us up to date with this developing story when it comes to Israel and its conflict and its fight against Hezbollah? There's been a meeting overnight, hasn't there, a cabinet meeting talking about the expansion of Israel's goals.
That's right. The meeting overnight ended with a very short statement from the Prime Minister's office this morning saying that the goals of the war that started back in October, the war that began to free Israeli hostages from Gaza and to defeat Hamas, they have added now a third goal to that war, which is to ensure the return of about 60,000 Israelis who have been displaced from the northern border to their homes, as well as tens of thousands of Israelis who were displaced from the border near Gaza. So Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet making explicit for the first time that one of the goals of this war is to return these displaced civilians to the border with Lebanon in the north.
They had been evacuated from their homes because of attacks by Hezbollah, is that correct? Where have they gone to, and why does the Israeli government believe that they should be returned now?
That's right. They were displaced in October of last year. It was the day after October 7th that Hezbollah began firing rockets at northern Israel in support of Hamas in Gaza. And within a couple of weeks after that, in October, most of northern Israel was depopulated. Dozens of towns and cities along the border were emptied out, and residents have gone wherever they can find a place to stay in the country. There are people staying in Tel Aviv. There are people staying down in the Negev in southern Israel. People have dispersed throughout the country, and they're increasingly angry, residents of the north, that the government doesn't seem to have a plan for ensuring their return. We've had almost a year now of back and forth bombardment between Israel and Hezbollah, but sort of no bigger strategy to do anything about the conflict there. And so there is, particularly with the start of a new school year now in Israel, there is growing frustration on the part of these displaced families.
Indeed. And what is there to guarantee their safety, given, as you say, that Israeli forces and Hezbollah have exchanged nearly daily strikes and missile attacks since October the 7th last year?
Well, there's nothing. As long as this is going on, when you go to the towns in northern Israel that have been depopulated since October, there are still a handful of residents living there, and there are obviously Israeli soldiers camped in and around many of these towns, and they're under constant fire with very little notice. The rocket sirens that give people, some degree of advance warning in other parts of Israel, they don't work as well in the north just because the distances to Lebanon obviously are much, much shorter there. Now, Hezbollah in Lebanon has been very clear since October that the only way they're going to stop shooting at Israel is if there is a ceasefire in Gaza. They have linked the ceasefire in the north to a ceasefire in Gaza, but the Israeli government has spent almost a year now refusing a ceasefire in Gaza, and Prime Minister Netanyahu vows to continue the war there. And as long as they do that, there is not going to be any real security in the north.
And that was reinforced yesterday by this comment from the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, saying that, I'm quoting here, the possibility for an agreement is running out as Hezbollah continues to tie itself to Hamas.
Right. And I think there are two things going on here with these comments from Gallant and this meeting overnight of the cabinet. One of them is there has been an increase in the intensity of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah over the past couple of weeks. We've seen that just in the volume of rockets, for example, being fired from Lebanon into Israel. It's now up to 50 or 60 rockets in a single barrage being fired. That is more than Hezbollah was firing a few months ago. So the fighting is more intense, and that obviously does raise a risk of an increased conflict. But then there's also a political story going on inside of Israel where Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to fire his defense minister. He wants to get rid of Yoav Gallant as part of a bigger deal to shore up his very fragile governing coalition. And he needs a pretext to fire his defense minister. And so talking now about the possibility of a conflict with Lebanon, about the need to return residents to the north, I think part of the reason Netanyahu is doing that is he wants to lay the blame for the failure to bring back those residents on his defense minister to give him a reason to fire that defense minister.
And that those rumors which were swirling around yesterday that you spoke about just then about, Netanyahu wishing to fire Yoav Gallant, it really destabilized the Israeli financial markets yesterday. So what does this suggest about the way that people are now reacting to the manner in which Netanyahu runs his government?
I think it tells you once again, people see Netanyahu not as having a war strategy so much as a strategy for his own political survival. He has clashed with Gallant on a number of issues since the war began in October. Gallant, for example, does support making a hostage deal with Hamas, even if that means halting the war in Gaza. Netanyahu has refused to do that. Gallant wants to talk about post-war political arrangements in Gaza. Netanyahu refuses to do that. And then there's the most immediate issue, I think, which is the question of draft exemptions for ultra-Orthodox Jews. Netanyahu wants to maintain those draft exemptions. He's worried that if they're removed, if they start being conscripted into the army, that ultra-Orthodox parties will leave his coalition, bring down his governing coalition. Gallant wants to get rid of those draft exemptions. And so Netanyahu, that's part of the reason Netanyahu wants him gone, is because of this issue. And he's looking to remove Gallant, replace him with Gideon Sa'ar, a politician who has no military experience whatsoever, bring him in as defense minister, and then bring in Gideon Sa'ar's party to add a few more seats to his governing coalition. That would give him some political breathing room, but it would mean that there is effectively no one with serious security experience in charge of the war.
And in the meantime, when we're looking at the Hezbollah situation and the idea to expand the war goals, I mean, what does that do for Israel's ability then to not just fight war with Hamas within Gaza, but also to expand its military operations with Lebanon?
Well, no one is talking about these issues right now. I mean, I think some Israeli military analysts and commentators have pointed out, for all the talk from Netanyahu and his fellow politicians about the need to expand the war in Lebanon, no one is talking about whether Israel can do that, as you say. And it's not just a question of what that means for the war in Gaza. It's also, there are some very sort of technical questions of, does Israel have the munitions that it would need to fight a bigger war in Lebanon? It's been obviously burning through huge numbers of bombs and rockets and missiles in Gaza over the past 11 months. Does it have the stockpiles of military equipment to fight a bigger war in Lebanon? And no one is really talking about those questions in public. There's a lot of very glib talk about how Israel could go fight a bigger war in Lebanon, but no one is talking about whether it can or what the goals of that war might be. It's going to be, I think, a much longer and much harder war than the one that Israel has fought in Gaza against a much better equipped enemy in Hezbollah. And these sorts of questions are not getting much attention in the public discourse in Israel.
And in the meantime, the operation in Gaza, there are reports that they are now having to target the northern part of the Strip once again, with suggestions that Hamas fighters are regrouping faster than Israel can defeat them.
And this keeps happening. Every few months, there are parts of Gaza in the north, as you say, Shujaiya in the east, even Khan Yunis, where the Israeli army spent months fighting earlier this year. All of these places, Israeli troops have had to go back into, sometimes 2 or even 3 times after finishing military operations there, because there is nothing to fill the power vacuum. They go in, they fight Hamas for a couple of weeks, they kill some unknown number of Hamas militants, but then they leave, and there is no political alternative in Gaza to provide stability, and therefore there's a vacuum that Hamas seeks to fill. This has been the problem for many months now. It's a problem that the Americans and other Western allies of Israel have tried to push the Netanyahu government on, trying to bring back perhaps the Palestinian Authority to provide security in Gaza, or stand up some other Palestinian entity to provide security there. Netanyahu refuses to talk about any of this. And so the reality is that nature abhors a vacuum, and Hamas will continue trying to fill that vacuum.
Greg Karlstrom, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. It is 9:12 a.m. in Moscow, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has ordered a boost in military personnel. He's hoping to raise the number of soldiers to 1.5 million, making it the second largest army in the world. But with the war in Ukraine now lasting more than 2.5 years, and according to figures from the UK government, more than 465,000 Russian personnel killed or wounded since the invasion began, where will these new recruits come from? Well, I'm joined now by Mark Galeotti, political analyst and author of Putin's Wars from Chechnya to Ukraine, and a regular voice here on Monocle Radio. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. This is the third time that Putin has boosted his numbers, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but we always have to distinguish between the numbers on paper and the numbers on reality. I mean, I can say that I'm going to drop 3 stone in the coming month. The devil is in the detail.
So, exactly. Tell us what detail we do have then.
Well, we have this figure of increasing troop size by about 180,000. Now, the problem is, at the moment, they're already having trouble filling the existing establishment strength, in other words, the paper strength. I mean, in Moscow, for example, they're having to offer volunteers not just really very generous salaries, but also about £17,500 just signing on bonus and so forth. So, it's all very well having these numbers, but clearly the thing that Putin is unwilling to do is court potential political disruption. So far, at least, he's holding back from another mobilization of reservists. He's not sending conscripts to the fighting inside Ukraine. So, I mean, it seems very hard to imagine that he can actually get these extra troops.
So do we know how he plans to go about getting these extra troops, which are hard to recruit?
Well, no, this is classic Putin. He issues these broad instructions and then expects the technocrats below stairs to actually sort of handle it. And I think this is where what we're going to see is a classic sort of Russian response, in that everyone's going to say, right on it, boss. And there's going to be a lot of flurry of activity and new posters and new promises and such like. But then when the dust settles in 6 months or whatever, we will probably see that they actually failed to meet this target.
So just explain to us why and in what areas Russia needs extra troops. I mean, we've seen the incursion into Russia by Ukraine, and we've also recently heard much discussion about Ukraine wishing to use longer range missiles to attack targets inside Russia. How much is this promise to deliver the 180,000 extra troops connected to these stories?
I mean, I think there's a partial connection. I mean, look, if one looks at what's going on, first of all, in terms of responding to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, the Russians have been basically wanting to make sure that they combat it without actually drawing away their really serious, toughened, seasoned reserve forces from the Donbass front to the east of Ukraine, in which they're actually making real advances. So, we have basically a random ragbag of forces being thrown there. But the point is, look, this notion of raising extra troops, it will be months down the line, if at all, that it actually has an impact on the ground. So it's not so much for that. I think it is much more connected to, as you said, this whole question of allowing Ukrainians to use longer range missiles against targets on the Russian mainland. Because here, Putin has done a lot to try and actually sort of ramp up the whole pressure. He's said that this would be tantamount to NATO declaring war on Russia. He's basically promised all kinds of unspecified but terrifying retaliation. Now, most of this is almost certainly just bluster. But nonetheless, I think this also fits into this notion that, be careful who you're picking a war with, because quite frankly, we could be even more dangerous and formidable. A lot of it is indeed an information operation rather than anything else.
Tell us a little bit about the state of play within the Russia and Ukraine conflict. There was an article written by the former BBC diplomatic editor of Newsnight, Mark Urban, this weekend, where he talked about exhaustion on both sides and the progression towards an endgame. He was suggesting that actually after 2.5 years, there must come a conclusion to this, and troop numbers and depletion and just them basically being worn out may be a major factor in this conflict coming to a close.
Look, Mark is a very seasoned observer, and I wish he were true, but I must admit I'm a little bit more cautious. First of all, if one looks at the Ukrainian side, they've actually finally passed a new law on raising more forces. And although it's going to be still some months down the line before we actually see the people who are currently being recruited actually being deployed to frontline units, nonetheless, that is happening. And likewise, look, Putin could raise more troops. He could have, despite the fact that it will be monstrously unpopular at home, another mobilization wave. The first time he did that, for example, he raised another 300,000 troops. Or he could be using conscripts in the war zone. Or, there are other ways in which he can, if he feels that he's being pushed into a corner, raise extra troops. So, yes, we are seeing a degree of exhaustion. But to be perfectly honest, I think both sides still have it in them to be fighting for at least another year.
Where can Russia draw its extra personnel from, if not necessarily from Russia? Because we've seen plenty of images of people fleeing Russia the moment the announcements like this are made. A very similar thing was made about exactly two years ago, and the rush for the border was incredible. So if Russia were to look elsewhere, in the way that it has looked elsewhere for supply of armament, who might it be able to rely on to send boots on the ground?
Well, we have already seen cases of troops being recruited from relatively impoverished countries in the global south, particularly, for example, Nepal, others from India and so forth. On the other hand, I think that is beginning to dry up. I think what looked at one point to be a source of easy money is really becoming clear that it's actually a very dangerous option to take. On the other hand, they might not need to. Yes, absolutely. You're perfectly right. Back in 2022, when Putin ordered a mobilization, in effect, for every soldier he actually brought to arms, 2 to 3 Russians fled the country. However, since then, they have passed laws and, more to the point, made practical moves so that once you're issued with a mobilization notice, that is automatically notified to the computers at the various border guard stations. So if you try and leave the country, at least legally, then if you have a mobilization notice kind of over your head, that will be evident and you won't be allowed out of the country. So they clearly have made moves to try and ensure that that kind of rush for the border can't happen again. But in the meantime, yes, they are gathering soldiers wherever they can find them. We've had cases from Cuba, from Africa and elsewhere. But these are in the hundreds, not in the thousands. They're not going to be able to make up the shortfall.
So if he can't raise that 180,000 soldiers, what will be the effect on Putin's war?
To be honest, in and of itself, it won't have any kind of effect. At the moment, there is already a substantive force. The main emphasis at the moment, after all, is on replenishing to make up for casualties. And at the moment, it seems that, very roughly speaking, they are able to recruit enough troops to make up the numbers. What we're actually likely to see is that the Russians aren't going to be able to expand their military. I mean, although earlier this year, the previous defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, announced that he was going to raise 14 more divisions and so forth, there's no evidence that that's going to happen anything like on paper. So, what it's going to mean is the war is going to continue, but Russia will not acquire some sort of massive new influx of troops sufficient to be able to really change the tenor of this war. We're still in a situation where we have it's not a stalemate, clearly, because the front lines are moving back and forth, but a deadlock in that neither side can deliver a knockout blow to the other.
Mark Galliotti, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme, why a penguin with a voice like this has been voted New Zealand's favourite bird. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Welcome, Theo.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Lovely to have you with us. This is your first
This is my
trip.
debut.
How are you feeling?
Nervous? No, it's a slightly different. Yeah, it's lovely to be here.
Good. Delighted to have you with us. Right, so you've been doing the heavy lifting for us with the papers. What have you spotted?
So I think what's interesting is the story in the FT about plans by the European Union to rush through an aid package for Ukraine totaling 38 billion euros, and they're going to pay for this with the money from seized Russian assets. Now, of course, the question is why the rush? Why is this so urgent? And there have been delays by Hungary's leader Viktor Orban, who would like to see the decision on aid, and of course he's a close ally of Vladimir Putin. He would like to see any aid package delayed until after the American election. Of course, if Donald Trump is elected, the dynamics, the tectonic plates behind this conflict could shift significantly. And that's why the EU have powers until the end of the year, and they're keen to use them now to get that money to Ukraine so that President Volodymyr Zelensky can keep up his war effort.
This is lessons learned from the last Trump administration, isn't it? That Europe needs to forge its own path because it cannot rely on the US.
Absolutely. And it's I think everybody is now starting to. We've seen a surge with Kamala Harris. She's doing much better than, of course, Joe Biden was doing. But I think there is, it's in Europe and here in the UK as well, it's much in the forefront of people's minds that this is not a slam dunk that, that there will be a win for the Democrats and that business will continue as usual. There's every chance that Donald Trump could win this election. Still, there are shy voters there who won't necessarily admit to pollsters that they're voting for the Republican candidate. And therefore, I think in Europe, they really want to get on now and ensure that Ukraine can stand on its own 2 feet with European support, but without the US should Donald Trump win that election.
It's absolutely crucial to Europe as well to have a stable Ukraine because at the moment it has a $38 billion financing gap for next year and is widely reliant on international aid just to keep the wheels turning, let alone its war machine. And for Europe to not to have an impoverished neighbour on its borders, which is fighting a war with Russia, is not a good thing.
No, and I think in Europe, and everybody is conscious. And when I've been speaking to people involved in defence here and the conflict in, who have a very keen eye on what's happening in Ukraine, they are very conscious, and Ukraine and Europe is very conscious that what could happen that if the money simply falls by the wayside. Russia is continuing to be able to fund this campaign by selling its natural resources around, elsewhere in the world, and that if it is able to continue with this war effort, and it is not abated, and Vladimir Putin's forces are not abated, or at least kept, at bay, then we'll end up in a situation where Ukraine eventually has to concede some sort sort of peace deal which would involve carving off part of the eastern part of the country to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin will go away with his tail up thinking, actually now, where can I have a go at next? Where's another soft target? And that's the real danger, that actually he then comes after an EU country, potentially a NATO country, potentially, and then we end up in a standoff where, Donald Trump has said that he is not in favour of supranational organisations like the European Union and like NATO, and that NATO is suddenly finding itself in a situation where it can't stand by Article 5 to defend one of its members.
Let's move to widespread reporting this morning, but there's an article in The Independent that you want to draw our attention to about flooding in Central Europe, and we have an entire city being evacuated in Poland yesterday, which is an astonishing feat.
Yes, it's the city of Nysa, and it's in southwest Poland, and it sits right next to a very large lake. And the mayor of the city, is conscious that with Storm Boris, which has already now claimed the lives of at least 16 people, that lake embankment could be breached, and there'd be a wave several meters high, according to some reports, sweeping through the city, and therefore they've decided to evacuate 44,000 residents. And this is, an ongoing, this has been a major disaster for Europe in terms of the flooding. We've seen it not just in Poland, in Austria and Czech Republic, Romania as well. And now we're seeing a whole city evacuated, 44,000 people, either being urged to get to the top floor of their buildings, flats potentially, in order to stay safe, or just evacuate entirely should Storm Boris breach that embankment and it be flooded.
And we now have Donald Tusk saying that parts of Poland are now going to be he's announced a state of natural disaster, releasing money, not just from Poland. But again, we're going back to the European Union and funding, aren't we? Yes. Because that means that if you announce a state of natural disaster, you can then go to Europe and say, we need some extra cash here. It feels as if the pockets just need to get deeper in the EU.
Yes, and he's asking, by in terms of aid that he's asking for, it's around 200 million euros. It's a little bit less than what's required for Ukraine. But, these are the challenges facing Europe right now. And that's not to mention, of course, the migration crisis. Some numbers out during the week where it was, there have been 1 million asylum applications within the European Union. So this is an institution that is under significant strain at the moment.
Let's move on to the perpetual story that British politics can never extract itself from, is who paid for your suit? I'm assuming everything is bought and paid for with you this morning.
Yes, yes. I go to. I don't have. I get 10 shirts for £200 or something like that.
You go to a shop?
I go to a shop and I pay for my clobber. But Keir Starmer and his wife, Lady Victoria, of course, received donations from Lord Wahid Ali. He's a TV mogul. He got more than £2,000 for his spectacles, £16,000 for his clothes, and then there was £5,000.
That's a big pair of specs, isn't it, for £2,000?
Well, I think there's a lot of specs. But apparently, according to David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, he needs to look his best for the British people. The Conservatives, incidentally, reported this to the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner and Daniel Greenberg, and actually and we now know just overnight that actually there isn't going to be an investigation. We would assume because Keir Starmer has brought all of his declarations up to scratch. From my understanding, this all goes back to the Taylor Swift concert, and you'll remember. I'll explain why, because this goes back to when Keir Starmer went with his 2 children and his wife to Taylor Swift, and they were tickets worth around £4,000. And Keir Starmer turned around and asked, well, actually, do I need to say that my wife claimed a ticket, my children claimed a ticket? But actually, no, the answer came back, no, they're your tickets, you claim them, you fill in the log for you, Keir Starmer. But actually, there is a separate rule when the sole beneficiary is a third party, i.e. a spouse, when it comes to clothes, that you have to make a declaration. Of course, this is off the back of the fact that Lord Wahid Ali received a AAA all-access pass to Downing Street and was able to attend meetings. And Keir Starmer, of course, came into Downing Street promising to clean up politics, that we wouldn't have any more of this type of cronyism.
I mean, there are 2 points here, aren't there? Firstly is the fact that if you have a qualified leading global human rights lawyer and also Prime Minister who struggles to fill in a basic form, then that also gives me an awful lot, and actually the rest of us, quite a lot of reassurance. But what I think a lot of the the feeling is here is quite a significant amount of disbelief that having prepared for a very long time to get into government and having gone in, says we're going to do service, this is all about duty, this is all about what you commit to your country. There are a few basic errors, which is, did someone give you that dress that actually you would hope that they would not make?
Yes, and I think also if you look at the comments that Keir Starmer made when he was over in Italy, when he was asked about this, he suggested that he'd be prepared to do it again, because he was asked about it and he said, all the rules were followed, and as long as all the rules are followed, that's okay. And he seems to be tone deaf to the look of this, because of course, while you have the hypocrisy, you also have this is happening at a time when the country is being told to tighten its belts. Here, we've got a very gloomy budget on Halloween from Rachel Reeves to look forward to, where we're going to see some significant tax rises potentially. We've got the decision to withdraw the winter fuel allowance from all but the very poorest pensioners, and there is a feeling, if your wife, and she, Lady Starmer attended London Fashion Week yesterday, and actually, to be fair to her, she was in a dress that she'd rented, or she'd been lent to her, which was a very similar model to the way that Michelle Obama used to clothe herself, in terms of taking fashion from designers who she would then promote, but it was always on you can borrow this dress for this particular occasion. But I just think it's not the best look when this is such a political row, and it is important. I think it's very. Keir Starmer and his team can get into the sort of mindset that this doesn't matter because it's 4.5 years to the next general election. But Keir Starmer has a 10-year project. And you did see, I think, with Rishi Sunak, where despite whatever he did, the British public had come to the view that actually they'd taken a decision about the Conservatives and nothing was going to change their mind.
So why do you think Labour's failing to read the room?
It's a very good question, and I think it's a question that it just seems to be that there's a little bit of inexperience there. They've been out of power. This would be my reading. They've been out of power for 14 years, and I think going in, there's a slight culture shock that actually, when you're in opposition, you can get away with stuff that you can't get away with in government. And I think that they just haven't made that mental leap yet, that actually they're the people in charge, and actually they need to make sure that they hold themselves to the very highest standards.
Theo Usherwood, thank you so much for coming in to bring us a paper review. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at the latest headlines. People living in several areas of Poland and the Czech Republic have been evacuated from their homes after this weekend's heavy rain and flooding. At least 17 people have now died as a result of the extreme weather. Poland's government has announced a state of natural disaster in some areas and said it set aside more than €230 million to help victims. The aircraft manufacturer Boeing has imposed a recruitment freeze after around 30,000 workers began a strike over pay last week. Additional measures such as furloughing managers and executives are also being considered. The company's chief financial officer Brian West said the strike is jeopardising the company's recovery. And the owner of Facebook, Meta, is to ban Russian media outlets such as RT, claiming they're carrying out covert influence operations online. The ban marks a sharp escalation in actions by the world's biggest social media company against Russian state media. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 8:33 in Zurich at 2:33 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Now, did the gunman, who's the subject of an FBI investigation into an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, have inside information on the former president's whereabouts? Ryan Wesley Routh has appeared in court in Florida charged with federal gun crimes. It's emerged that he was hiding on the edge of Trump's Florida golf course for nearly 12 hours. Well, Paul Rogers is an international security advisor at Open Democracy and a regular voice. Very good morning to you, Paul.
Morning, Emma. Hi.
So the big question is, do we believe that there was some sort of inside information? Because this man seemed to know exactly where he needed to be at the right time.
It's possible, but not necessarily. The point is that there's a pretty good chance that in any one day in the recent weeks, Trump would have been playing golf on his own golf course. That is possible. And it does appear that Ryan Wesley Routh was a very unusual character. And it's quite possible that he could have actually camped out on the anticipation that he would get a chance to have a go at Trump. It's a long shot. Sorry, very bad use of a phrase there. But it's a possibility, and it's certainly one that will be investigated. And it comes at a time when there is sort of heightened potential for political violence right across the spectrum. So one shouldn't be surprised too much at what has happened generally, and it's making for a very major headache for the security service. But for the moment, I think we have to say what on earth was going on. Was he actually in one spot for those 12 hours? Was he sort of going around a bit or what? It's a difficult one, but I think for the moment, I think you have to reserve judgment on whether this was actually more grim than we even think it may have been. I
mean, it's absolute tribute to Trump's security detail that, by all accounts, they spotted the barrel of a rifle sticking out from a bush, which is something rather, admirable to, well done to the team. But the issue also remains on the amount of security that Donald Trump has and the security around his situations and his circumstances. I mean, we are already talking about a presidential candidate who has been shot in the last couple of months. But to find himself on a golf course, they are not the easiest places to police if you don't have the full presidential privilege of being able to shut down an entire area.
I think that's the whole point. I mean, essentially, you could argue that the Secret Service should already be putting far more effort into Trump. But there are limits beyond which it's very difficult to go. And as you say, crucially, if it's a president, then the Secret Service and the other authorities can do far more than under normal circumstances. But the wider issue is, I think you're seeing a climate of what one have to call potential for political violence, which has always been there in American politics. You think back 60 years ago, if one could remember that far, of what had happened in the Kennedy era, with Kennedy going, with his brother Robert Kennedy going, also assassinated, and then Lee Harvey Oswald, who had actually shot Kennedy, himself being killed. That was at a time when there were the huge concerns about the way in which the United States was deteriorating into political violence. And we've seen that more recently. I think, of course, it came to a head back in the early years of this current Biden presidency with the threat to actually, basically stage a coup on the Capitol. Of course, that was avoided. But the point, I think, is that we have this sort of climate of political violence, which is in the United States and isn't going to go away anytime soon, and in many ways is exacerbated by the kind of rhetoric that Trump is using. I mean, one of his responses yesterday was basically to blame this assassination attempt specifically on Biden and Harris. Now, that really does up the ante repeatedly. But what you're going to see now is that because he is so concerned with himself, is so sort of confident in himself, he thinks he can more or less go anywhere and he'll be okay. This second attempt may finally bring that in, but you're going to have very strong characters who will tell Trump he can't do so-and-so on the campaign trail. And I rather sort of envy any Secret Service person who has to do that, because it's a big responsibility and a tough nut as well.
So if we are in an era now where there is violent attacks on presidential candidates twice in 2 months, and you're linking it to rhetoric from Donald Trump from, let's say, about 2016 onwards, where he has maintained a path that it is okay for people to lash out at each other, that reconciliation is not necessarily his chosen path. What do security details do now in this era when this heightened atmosphere of violence doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon?
I think there are two things. All that the security people can do is to basically increase their resources, improve their training, and try and always set the net wider, if you like, the net of protection of whoever is the key candidate. But the second thing, I think, is that this is a time when you have to have other political leaders speaking very forcefully about the need to avoid this kind of climate. It's going to be very difficult. And I mean, a huge amount is going to depend on what happens with this next election result. If Trump actually wins, then I think all bets are off in terms of the political stability of the United States, at least in the short term. If he loses, then it will still be very difficult, but it will be absolutely crucial for somebody like Kamala Harris to lead the way into a slightly easier political era. Otherwise, we're going to see this kind of thing repeated. The problem is that somebody like Trump, the populist as he is, ratchets things up. And once he's moved things in a particular direction, it's pretty difficult to turn them around. And to some extent, I think this is what we're seeing now. And we're seeing, as you said, the results of sort of right back since 2016, this change in the rhetoric. You had it to some extent many years ago. And of course, Reagan himself was very confident of his own position. He actually survived an attempt. But essentially, I think this is, in some ways, a more extreme political era for the United States. And that really means that almost anybody right through to the top is at a somewhat greater risk. And we're seeing that both with the attack on the Capitol and what has happened in the last couple of months with Trump.
Paul Rogers, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Greece is joining the growing number of nations experiencing a decline in its population. There are predictions that the number of Greek citizens could drop by a quarter in the next half century. That's a far higher figure than the rest of Europe. The country's Prime Minister has described it as an existential challenge for our future. Well, joining me is Evdoxia Limperi, who's the UK correspondent at ERT, the Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation. A very good morning to you, Evdoxia.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for having me.
So how does a declining population, or what should I say, does a declining population in Greece look like?
Well, it looks really, really bad, and it goes on for many years now like that. It took the report in Euronews, apparently, and Elon Musk comment in his platform X for the ominous problem of population decline in Greece and Europe to find its way to the international press. The latest Eurostat figures show an unprecedented population decline in Greece. In 2022, the country recorded fewer than 77,000 births, almost the lowest in the century, while deaths almost doubled that number, reaching 140,000. According to estimates, by 2070, Greece's population could shrink by up to 25%, and that is well above the EU average of 4%. And nothing suggests that this trend will change anytime soon. In the last 60 years, from 1950 to 2010, the population in Greece increased by approximately 4 million. And since 2010, it fell back to just over 10 million. So the situation doesn't look good in the future either. The predictions for the median age is to increase from 44.4 now to 52 in 2060. The population is aging fast. This is a huge problem. The current government of Mr. Mitsotakis attended to that problem. He announced a pack of measures to attend this problem, so that the measures regard family support, the reform of social benefits, support for working parents' lives. The situation went very bad since the economic crisis from 2010. I mean, the economic crisis started in 2008, and many people, hundreds of thousands, left the country to seek a better future, a better economic future in other countries around the world. And now there were no social benefits in the country for the people, no incentives, if you want, for people to give birth, to make a family. Everybody who speaks about it says that they don't. The wages, the salaries are not enough to support a family, to rent a house, to rent a flat, and to support a family. So they don't give birth. People are afraid to give birth to children because they don't know how to support them in the country. What this government now, what Mr. Mitsotakis and his government announced a few days ago, includes about 20 million euros in benefits for new parents, new nursery places, employers who facilitate their staff with benefits of up to 5,000 per year to new parents will be exempt from tax on this amount. So it is a combination of different departments of the government to contribute to this problem, and it's the departments from health, the departments from social cohesion and family, department of housing, department of labor. All these departments of the government contributed with special program to help the new couples and the young people to give birth. There's an interesting scheme that they came about with, the neighborhood nannies. So they will give to people in the neighborhood that maybe they don't have part-time jobs or no jobs at all, because there is a lack of jobs in Greece as well. Many people are out of work. They will give. They can have this program. They can look after other people's children, so they can go to work, and the government will give vouchers of up to 500 per child for this scheme. There are some new things that they hope they will change this trend that sees the population in deep decrease, which is quite hopeless. And people, also they want to stop people, young people, educated people in Greece. The education is for free. So the majority of the people are highly educated in the university. So they don't want to see all these young, dynamic ages to leave the country or to stay and don't create families because they cannot afford.
Evdoxia Limperi, I don't wish to interrupt you, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time now to talk urbanism with Monocle's contributing editor Sheena Rossiter, who joins us on the line from Edmonton in Canada. Good evening, Sheena.
Good evening. Well, good morning to you.
Good to have you with us. Just explain to us a little bit more about the latest news from the 15-minute city. It's been a concept that's been bandied around for a very long time now, but are there any cities which are actually achieving this goal?
Yeah, so as we know, this concept really started to gain traction during the COVID-19 pandemic when lockdowns kind of forced people, and it just shrunk all of our worlds, and it made us kind of focus on local neighborhoods. So in a study that was released Monday that was published in the Journal of Nature Cities, researchers selected a total of 54 cities across the globe and explored the details where they kind of looked to see what cities were supposedly these 15-minute cities where you can access everything within 15 minutes of walking. And no surprise that mid-sized European cities such as Zurich, Milan, Copenhagen, and Dublin, they were the ones that were really accomplishing this concept of a 15-minute city where 95% of the residents could actually access things within walking distance in 15 minutes from their house. And that's just a tiny fraction of the 10,000 cities around the world that are considered these so-called 15-minute cities that was released in this study on Monday. And so it's really what they did when they looked at it is they looked at this open source data map, and they figured out how far you can walk or cycle for different services, including shops, restaurants, education, exercise, healthcare, things like that. And they looked at places that residents had where there was more than 1 million people living. So it's no surprise that European cities did pretty well. And what should be clear to be noted is that these 15-minute cities that did well, they had quite a crucial factor when it came to density. So people were just living a lot closer to one another, and then therefore it was much easier to access services because they were more likely to be around because people just lived quite a bit closer. And no surprise as well that one of the bigger cities that's doing quite well with this is Paris, which is one of the cities that really championed the concept back in 2020 and has been making strides ever since.
It seems to be a fairly European concept. I mean, the origins are French, but you mentioned there that the more densely populated cities. So when you talk about the likes of Paris, Milan, they do well. Mm-hmm. One would imagine, though, that where you are, it's slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, where I live, Edmonton was a champion. It was one of the least densely populated cities in North America, just known for its sprawl. And some cities that have done particularly bad with this are cities that are just focused on the car, particularly in North America and, of course, the United States, where things are just mapped out quite a bit more. So Atlanta did pretty bad when it came to that 15-minute city where its walkability index was pretty low. And the next Olympic host city, Los Angeles, wasn't too far behind. For anybody who's been to Los Angeles, it's not hard to know that you really need a car to get around there. But one thing I should make clear, Emma, is that the researchers behind this study say that 15 minutes aren't some sort of utopia. American sprawling cities, they are built different. They have their own houses and backyards, where European cities live in a more densely populated areas and apartments. So it's just a different way of living. And of course, there are parts of the United States like New York, namely the island of Manhattan, which has always kind of been a 15-minute city. So there are places that do reach that threshold here in North America, but it's just not everywhere.
And how does that actually affect the prices, the ability for people to work, renting spaces, renting office spaces, buying property?
Well, in places like here in Canada, people are looking for walkability index, even though we are a pretty cold country with winter for a large chunk of the year. In bigger cities like Toronto, it actually is really starting to shape rental rates for office buildings just because it's so difficult for people to get downtown. And with the pandemic, a lot of people were wanting to stay home a little bit more. So a recent report from Colliers is basically saying that the average lower commute, so every 10 minutes that's knocked down on commuting, there's a 2% correlation to a lower vacancy rate in office buildings. So if they can create more offices that are located closer to where people live, so not necessarily in the downtown core, but spread things out a little bit more, that could bring down vacancy rates in what were kind of empty office towers post-pandemic. So it's definitely impacting where people want to rent office space and that kind of commercial real estate aspect.
Let's move on to another subject which cities have to deal with the whole time, which is their temperature, and that cities are, by their very nature, warmer because of the number of people who live there closely packed together. But they're overheating, aren't they?
Yeah, this isn't really surprising. And again, a study done here in Canada, namely by a researcher for the School of Urban and Regional Planning and the director of Alberta Land Use Institute at the University of Alberta, Sandeep Agarwal, he and his team, they basically looked at different cities across Canada in Edmonton, Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal. And they started using satellite images looking at the surface area of temperatures in these cities. And they found that urban areas were often 6 to 12 degrees hotter than rural areas. And this is just really concerning for what it means for a warming planet with these heat island effects that we've seen. This is nothing new, but just to kind of see that cities are trapping and radiating heat that much more, that now cities really do have to start taking different measures in order to cool things down a little bit more. And we've seen this done a little bit in Toronto, where they've enacted strong protections around cutting down trees, for example. So more trees will, keep things a little bit cooler, and also implementing these sort of green rooftops where you can see gardens and things like that on rooftops to kind of have it so heat's not trapped in as much. And the way that buildings are now being designed in colder places like Canada, despite the fact that it is colder, is still overheating. And so from the early stages of design, they're really looking at positioning buildings to kind of minimize the amount of sunlight that's coming into windows, and having thicker insulation on windows to actually keep heat out as opposed to having it come in.
Sheena Rossiter, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Finally, step up the hoi-haw, referred to by some unkind observers as a smelly penguin. Now, hoi-haw means noisy shouter in Maori, but despite all this, the hoi-haw has won New Zealand's annual Bird of the Year award. And Stephen Moss, naturalist and author of many books, and he joined me last year for last year's announcement, joins me now. Very good morning, or good afternoon, I should say to you, Stephen.
Good morning, Emma.
Good to have you with us.
I'm actually in the UK, so no, definitely morning.
Ah, right, OK. Let's talk about the hoi-haw. Noisy shouter, the world's rarest penguin, and a bit smelly. Why is it a winner?
I think the great thing about this competition, and there's one in Australia as well, Bird of the Year, is people don't just go for the obvious. If we held this in Britain, it would be the robin, wouldn't it, every blooming year? Whereas the Kiwis go for things like the yellow-eyed penguin. It's such a great bird. This is a bird that's very rare. It needs a lot of help from us. It's really beautiful. You can look at it online and see how gorgeous it is. And it's called a noise shouter in Maori, the hoi-hoi. You pronounce it better than I do. But it sounds quite nice to me.
It does indeed. It is desperately shy, isn't it?
I think, some penguins, sort of strut about. And if you ever go to somewhere like Antarctica, as I've been fortunate enough to do, they walk right up to you. You're not meant to get within 2 meters of them, but you can't really help it. But this bird is a shy bird. It's only found on, in South Island, New Zealand. It's one of these birds we should celebrate. Most of your listeners wouldn't have heard of it before now, and that's a perfectly reasonable situation. But, it's a bird we should be caring for. So I'm really pleased it's won the competition.
I wish I could say this is all desperately innocent, but there have been allegations for several years now that the New Zealand bird competition has been fixed, and not just by anybody, but by the Russians.
Yes, that came out. I can't quite remember what happened there. I remember the Australians trying to get the shag to win it, presumably because that's a bit of a arf. Isn't that hilarious if a shag wins the best New Zealand bird? And also in 2021, the Bird of the Year was won by a bat. And as I'm sure all your listeners know, bats are not birds, even though they fly. So, it's a bit of a weird competition. And then that's the point. When it gets a bit of controversy, of course, it gets publicised all around the world. And that can only help New Zealand's fantastic birds.
Stephen Moss, thank you so much for joining us here on The Globalist, and we look forward to hearing from you this time next year for the 2025 winners. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Chris Chermak, Hassan Anderson and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Sana Jamani, and our studio manager and New Zealand bird pronunciation consultant was Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.